The year was 536. Changes happened fast, literally overnight. People began to wonder if it was indeed the end of the world as they knew it. They soon noticed that their silhouettes didn't cast any shadows, even at noon. The sun was becoming weirder by the day, turning bluish in color. The moon had lost its shine altogether. Soon enough, it already looked as if the seasons were all mixed together in one single day. Frost and snow started to appear in the middle of summer. The ocean seemed to become angrier too, with currents moving at unseen speeds. At one point, the sun was only shining for about 4 hours a day, and it had lost most of its power. The rain stopped falling altogether, and the temperatures dropped lower than ever before. If you look at historical writings from back then, it's easy to see why people lost all hope. Since there was no sun and no rain, crops were badly affected. There was not much food going around for people or animals. Territories that now belong to Italy or Ireland, to Japan and Central America were all affected by what would become a decade-long thick fog that shifted the planet's temperature. The human population decreased by about 100 million, while those that survived seemed to have lost their sense of purpose. So soon enough, cities collapsed. It's for good reason that the year 536 is considered by a lot of historians to be the worst time to be alive. It took scientists years to figure out this mysterious period in our history and what might have caused such a shift in the global climate. But with the help of an ultra-precise analysis of ice from a Swiss glacier, we might finally have the answer. The team behind the research figured out that the culprit was a volcanic eruption that began in Iceland. The result was a large amount of volcanic ash getting transported all over the northern hemisphere at the beginning of 536. This event was followed by 2 other similar eruptions, one in 540 and the other in 547. If that wasn't unlucky enough, the world would soon be overwhelmed with disease, which disrupted the world's economy. It took humankind until 640 to bounce back to normalcy. Even though we have this piece of the puzzle in place, how can a volcanic eruption on a small island cause so much damage? It turns out that when a volcano erupts, large amounts of sulfur, bismuth, and other damaging substances get mixed in the atmosphere. The larger the eruption, the more substances get sprayed into the protective gas layer. All these elements create an aerosol veil which acts like a mirror. It reflects sunlight back into space. As a result, the whole planet gets darker and colder. And if we look at the data, it makes a lot of sense. Almost every unusually cold summer we've had over the past 2,500 years happened after a volcanic eruption. Back in the 6th century, these eruptions occurred really fast, one after another, which could also explain why the whole period lasted 18 months. This wasn't the only year that baffled scientists when it came to Earth's climate. The year 1816, for example, was also dubbed the year without a summer. Mount Tambora in Indonesia is probably to blame for this one, since it erupted in 1815. This event was the largest of its kind in 10,000 years. As a result, the global average temperature ranged by almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Globally, a lot of events happened, although at the time they seemed isolated. In New England, for example, because of the cooler temperatures, crops failed, so a lot of farmers had to move to the west. The demographic of the country remained reshaped forever. In continental Europe, the potato harvest was lost almost in its entirety, resulting in some of the worst periods of famine people had ever experienced there. Humankind aside, what could really be considered the worst day on Earth? Scientists have come up with this candidate almost unanimously. The worst day in our planet's history happened almost exactly 66 million years ago. It was when an asteroid about the size of Manhattan broke through the Earth's atmosphere and landed on the Yucatan Peninsula. People believed it happened somewhere in June or July. This space traveler created a 20-mile wide hole in our planet's surface. Chunks of soil and rock were displaced, some even making it halfway to the moon. They didn't stay up there though. Some came back at an astonishing speed, having been turned into spheres of molten glass. They lit up forests and large areas of land until fires were raging everywhere. Some got stuck in outer space and eventually blocked the sun's rays, cooling the planet altogether. What followed immediately were multiple powerful earthquakes and damaging tsunamis sweeping across the Gulf of Mexico. By the time our planet regained some form of normalcy, 75% of all species on Earth had vanished. The most famous of all? Dinosaurs. This asteroid theory was first proposed in 1980, but it's still up for debate in the scientific community. None of our planet's other large-scale extinctions were triggered by an asteroid impact. What made this one so special was that it caused dinosaurs to disappear altogether, even the most resilient. Leave it to passionate scientists to come up with another interesting story. The impact might have altered the chemical composition of Earth's oceans. The seawater might have become acidic, and tiny plankton that sit at the base of the marine food chain could have disappeared for a while. What followed might have been a series of species vanishing in a domino effect. Top that with other events that followed the asteroid impact, like the lack of sunlight and the overall cooling down of our planet. Now it's easy to see why this really might have been the worst day in our planet's history. But Earth is millions of years old, and not all of them were that bad. Let's travel back to ancient Egypt, which was way ahead of its time when it came to technology, science, medicine, and architecture. A lot of people had access to education and medical care. They had an opportunity to do sports and take up other leisure activities. A lot of things that are familiar to us these days and that we consider to be quite modern were available for ancient Egyptians. Pens, breath mints, toothpaste, board games, and even makeup. Others say Athens in the 4th to 5th century BCE was quite a nice time too. People there had equal rights, no matter what their social or educational level was. And speaking of wealth, it was also distributed between people pretty equally. If you had lived in those days and liked wandering through the city, you might have stumbled upon Aristotle, Plato, and Hippocrates. Their ideas became the base of what we now know as Western civilization. Theater, literature, and architecture also flourished during that time. Italy during the Renaissance period was also pretty nice. That's when the country saw an economic, cultural, and artistic transformation following a gruesome period of famine and disease. Workers now had the ability to ask for better working conditions and higher wages. The economy was flourishing too, which allowed arts and culture to expand. Wealthy members of Italian society had enough funds to become patrons for artists, writers, architects, and scientists. Now let's take 1804. It was the year we got introduced to the modern railway, and our ways of transportation were changed forever. It was the year when Englishman Richard Trevithick came up with the first practical steam locomotive. It was the first time when a large number of passengers were transported over a really long distance. And how about the year 1876? That's when the telephone was invented. Can you imagine a life without your cell phone today? It was Alexander Graham Bell that patented the first phone in the 19th century. As for the cell phone, it was Martin Cooper, an engineer from Motorola, who came up with the first handheld phone.
As much as we all wait for summer, this season is going crazy. I mean, a typical summer in Death Valley can be as hot as 130 degrees Fahrenheit. But you know what? The year 1816 was a total bummer. Guess why? Because that year, there was literally no summer at all. Seriously, where was all the warmth and sunshine in Europe and North America? Well, turns out the answer lies on the other side of the world, at Mount Tambora in Indonesia. Now picture this. On April 5, 1815, Mount Tambora, a mighty volcano far away in Bali, started making some serious noise, and boy, did it explode. It was the biggest volcanic eruption ever recorded in history. The eruption was so intense that it spewed tons of ash and aerosols into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun and turning the sky into a gloomy mess. The ash even fell on nearby towns, burying them under layers of ash. There were reports of several feet of ash floating on the ocean surface. Imagine sailing through that mess. But here's where it gets really crazy. Those tiny particles of ash and aerosols were light enough to travel through the atmosphere for months. They made their way into the stratosphere, spreading all over the world. Do you see what I'm driving at? They caused the Earth's average temperature to drop nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Thankfully, it was only temporary, and eventually, even the smallest particles fell out of the atmosphere, allowing the sunshine to return. If you imagine the year without a summer as a year when you have to wear a down jacket even in July, you're right. If you could only pick 3 words to describe that summer, these would be cold, gloomy, and dark. That summer of 1816, it was snowing in New England. Western Europe had cold rain non-stop. It was a total climate roller coaster with temperatures. Europe was hit the hardest, with summer temperatures reaching record-breaking lows. We're talking about the coldest summer in over 200 years. Now, let's take a look at the year without summer's impact on Europe and North America. It was a disaster. A ton of serious problems happened all across the Northern Hemisphere. Crops were wiped out by frost or lack of sunlight, leaving people hungry and desperate. Farmers who managed to grow crops were terrified of being robbed because food became so valuable. And get this, with the scarcity of oats, which became super expensive, it cost a fortune to feed horses. Guess what that means? Travel became ridiculously expensive since horses were the main mode of transportation back then. But hey, maybe this crazy situation inspired a dude named Carl Dray to invent the bicycle. Who needs a horse when you can pedal your way around, right? This is how it happened. Carl was like, maybe there's a better way to get around without relying on animals. Let's use some good old human power. And that's how the Laufmaschine, pardon my German, the bicycle was born. Fast forward a year, Carl decided to take his Laufmaschine for its first ride in Mannheim. This thing was known as the Dreissing, Velocipede, or Dandy Horse in England. It was basically the OG version of bicycles and motorbikes, using the two-wheel principle. This machine weighed about 48 pounds, had wheels with brass ball bearings covered in iron, and was mostly made out of wood. No pedals, but it was still steerable and had a rear wheel brake. It even had a short tail in front to keep it balanced. On June 12, 1817, Carl hopped in his Laufmaschine and rode from Mannheim to a coaching inn, which was about 8 miles away. He did it in under an hour. Not bad for a wooden bike without pedals, huh? The year without a summer also had a big impact on the settling of the American heartland. A ton of people, especially those poor farm families who got wiped out by the disaster, said peace out to New England and headed to western New York and the Northwest Territory. They were on the hunt for a better climate, richer soil, and just overall better conditions for growing stuff. Indiana became a state in 1816, followed by Illinois 2 years later. Plus, Vermont took a major hit in population during this time. Like we're talking about a decrease of 10,000 to 15,000 people. That's like erasing 7 whole years of population growth. Now, to borrow a bicycle analogy, let's switch gears for a sec. In June 1816, it rained like crazy during the summer. So these famous peeps like Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, and John William Polidori were stuck inside the Villa Diodati in Switzerland. They were on vacation, but Mother Nature was not cooperating. So they decided to have a little contest to see who could write the scariest story. Mary Shelley ended up writing Frankenstein, which we all know is a classic. And Lord Byron wrote this thing called A Fragment, which Polidori later used as the inspiration for The Vampire, which was like a prequel to Dracula. Can you imagine being stuck inside with these literary geniuses? Anyway, those days at Villa Diodati were pretty intense. They were filled with tension and deep conversations about life and stuff. Mary Shelley even had a dream about Frankenstein while she was there, and that's how her famous story began. Oh, and Lord Byron got inspired to write a poem called Darkness, because one day it got so dark that the birds went to bed early and they had to light candles like it was midnight. The poem is all about the year without a summer, so it's like he turned the crazy weather into art. So, after Mount Tambora blew its top, the atmosphere was all filled up with tephra, creating this hazy sky that stuck around for a few years. And you know what? Those sunsets were absolutely stunning, with rich red hues that you would only see after a volcanic eruption. Paintings from that time totally back it up, too. They show that these vibrant reds weren't around before the eruption. But that's not all. The paintings also got all moody and dark, even when the sun and moon were shining. It's like everyone's mood took a turn for the worse. Instead of happy and carefree afternoons, the themes shifted to religion, industry, and just a hint of despair. The artists were all about capturing reality. So these paintings were like snapshots of life before and after the eruption. Take Caspar David Friedrich's works, for example. His pieces like The Monk by the Sea and Two Men by the Sea really show this change in mood. Right, if there was a year without summer, there must have been at least 1 year without winter. Yup. The winter of 1877-78 in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota was like no other. They even called it the year without a winter. It was the warmest winter on record, with an average temperature of 29 degrees Fahrenheit from December to February. Now, you might think that the people living there back then were loving this warm weather, right? Well, not exactly. See, back in those days, they relied heavily on horses and sleigh for travel. But with the lack of snow and dirt roads, it made getting around a real pain in the you-know-what. Businesses were also affected because they couldn't move their goods easily. Despite the overall warmth, there were a few freezing days in early January 1878 that froze the mighty Mississippi River in St. Paul. It was closed for navigation until the end of February. Only 3 days for the rest of the cool season had single-digit temperatures or lower. The warmth didn't stop there. Even March 1878 was unusually warm. The first boat arrived in Duluth, Minnesota on March 17th, which was way earlier than usual. And lakes like Minnetonka and Osakis lost their ice way ahead of schedule too. It was like spring came knocking on their doors super early. It may seem that all this warmth meant it was a dry winter, but nope. From December 1877 to February 1878, they actually had over 3 inches of precipitation. That's more than the average for that time. Mother Nature sure knows how to keep us on our toes.
It's a snowy winter night. You're inside your cozy house and watching a historical movie that takes place during the Middle Ages. As you take another sip of your hot chocolate, you can't help but wonder how the people survived the winter back then. At that exact moment, your TV screen suddenly turns into a portal and pulls you inside. Whoa! You open your eyes to find yourself within the world of the movie you were just watching. A man approaches you and says, "Welcome to my medieval village. I am Bartholomew, and I called you here to give you an answer to your question. First of all, let me tell you that conditions became extremely harsh when the cold arrives, and not just for the northern countries. Mainland Europe takes its share of the brutal weather too. So winter is kind of a slowing down time for all of us. You see, we usually associate winter with old age and poverty because of all the changes that occur in nature during this time. For example, we can't really grow any crops when snow covers all our land. And by the early 14th century, things started to get even worse because we started seeing the first signs of what you may know as the Little Ice Age. Cold temperatures peaked. Weather anomalies and extreme events such as sudden floods or hailstorms started to occur, which added to our agony. Take the winter of 1359, for instance. Across central Italy, the snow rose to extraordinary heights. People had to throw the snow into the streets to lighten up their roofs. And because of that, some towns were completely blocked. Their inhabitants were trapped in their homes for several days. Another example of this is the winter of 1389. The snowfall was so great in the Luzerne region of France that many people's farmsteads and houses were destroyed. Bartholomew notices that you start shivering. Ah, you were not prepared for this journey back to medieval winters, I see. Let's walk to my home and find you some warmer clothes. As you can see, I'm already wearing a cloak, a scarf, and mittens, which are all made out of wool. I also have boots that are made out of leather from a deer. Still, all these are not really enough to stay warm when one is outside. That's why we usually layer other clothes underneath them all to keep the warmth trapped. By the way, the wool can get heavy and itchy sometimes. So beneath our woolen outer clothing, we wear linen undergarments too. The linen acts as a barrier between the wool and the skin, therefore making things a bit more comfortable for us. It is also easier to wash linen clothes, and they dry way faster than woolen ones. The wealthier ones can line their winter clothing with fur, and us regular peasants sometimes use rabbit and lamb for the same purpose. It's not as glamorous, but still effective. We can also hunt some wild animals and birds with the permission of the Lord. Yet again, the sumptuary laws, in other words, consumption laws, are very clear on who can wear what according to their social standing. Take the 1363 English sumptuary law, for example. It states that the wives and daughters of craftspeople and land-owning peasants were only allowed to wear lamb, rabbit, cat, and fox furs. You notice a weird-looking hinged metal sphere in Bartholomew's pocket, and ask him what that is.
Ah, it's a hand warmer, he says, as he gives it to you. If we are going to be outdoors for a long time, we bring one of these with us. Otherwise, one's fingers can get numb, you know. Now take a closer look at it, and you'll see that it has tiny holes on its surface. This helps the heat to escape, so that we can warm our hands without burning them once we fill it with hot coal.
That's kinda heavy, you say, and think about how lucky you are to be living in modern times. With just one click from the comfort of your home, you can order Hot Hands instant hand warmers from Amazon, and no coal is necessary. You can even put those inside your shoes to warm your toes, since they're pocket-sized, unlike this metal orb. You and Bartholomew arrive at his house. You realize that he does not take any of his outer garments off.
We keep everything on during the coldest months, because the indoor heating isn't always great, he says. As you can see, the fireplace stands here at the center of our homes, and right above it, there is a ventilation hole, rather than a chimney, which causes us to lose so much of the heat. Yet again, we don't usually sleep in our outside clothes. Instead, we put bricks and stones in the fire, wrap them in fabric, and take them to our beds to warm the sheets. Wearing our nightcaps all night long also helps. And when we're not sleeping, we usually try to stay close to the fireplace as much as possible.
You sure appreciate that hot water bottle of yours more now, right? And you didn't even need to cover it with a cloth, like these folks have to do. It already came with a knit cover for your convenience. And the best part is, it's much softer than a brick, and can be heated in the microwave within seconds.
How rude of me! I forgot to offer you something to eat, Bartholomew says. I know I already told you winter means stillness for us, but we still need to put in some work to not starve. There's a lot of preparation to be done in advance to survive these medieval winters. First of all, we start gathering wood for the fire from as early as spring and through the summer. Then there's the food we harvest in the fall. We have to preserve that in a special way, so all will last over the winter months. The same thing goes for meat, too. The methods we use include pickling, drying, and brining. In terms of grains, cereals, and pulses, we dry them out and store them in ceramic or clay pots. We later use them for making potted stews and soups, in addition to vegetables. Basically, everything we can find goes into the pot. The most common foods we eat in our everyday lives include onions, peas, beans, lentils, and herbs such as parsley. We still have to include protein in our diet, though. And we do that by eating cheese, eggs, fatty bacon, or salted pork. In terms of fresh fruits and berries, they are hard to find during wintertime, so we preserve the ones we already picked by the air drying method too. You think to yourself, if only these people had a food dryer at home, their lives would be so much easier. They could use it for all the foods Bartholomew just mentioned, from fruits to meat. Then again, there's no electricity here. I wouldn't want you to think winters are so grim, long, and boring after everything I've told you. We still do plenty of activities to keep ourselves entertained, Bartholomew says. But what? It's not like they can binge watch their favorite TV shows. We play in the snow a lot, adults and children all together. You can see plenty of peasants ice skating on the frozen lakes. To be able to do that, we used to use pieces of polished wood or horse shin bones. But now, we have iron skates too. I need to mention though, here in Western Europe, ice skating is not as common as in Scandinavia. That is because they are more accustomed to snow and cold temperatures. Sledding is another fun activity we do. Then there are indoor games, such as chess, backgammon, and other dice games. Wool spinning and telling stories are also common ways to spend some nice time with our family. Not surprisingly, nobles have more opportunities in the entertainment area too. For example, boar hunting is very common amongst the elite. At that moment, a portal appears at the door. Bartholomew says, "Guess it's time for you to head back, traveler. Fare thee well."